Section 11, Part 2, Chapter 4 of Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. Chapter 4 The Deluge Legends of Other Nations. A collection of the Deluge legends of other nations will throw light upon the Biblical and Chaldean records of that great event. The author of the treatise on the Syrian Goddess acquaints us with the Diluvian tradition of the Arameans, directly derived from that of Chaldea, as it was narrated in the celebrated sanctuary of Hierapolis, or Bambyce. The generality of people, he says, tells us that the founder of the temple was Deucalion Sisythes, that Deucalion in whose time the great inundation occurred. I have also heard the account given by the Greeks themselves of Deucalion. The myth runs thus: the actual race of men is not the first, for there was a previous one, all the members of which perished. We belong to a second race, descended from Deucalion, and multiplied in the course of time. As to the former men, they are said to have been full of insolence and pride, committing many crimes, disregarding their oath, neglecting the rites of hospitality, unsparing to suppliants. Accordingly, they were punished by an immense disaster. All on a sudden, enormous volumes of water issued from the earth, and rains of extraordinary abundance began to fall. The rivers left their beds, and the sea overflowed its shores. The whole earth was covered with water, and all men perished. Deucalion alone, because of his virtue and piety, was preserved alive to give birth to a new race. This is how he was saved. He placed himself, his children, and his wives in a great coffer that he had, in which pigs, horses, lions, serpents, and all other terrestrial animals came to seek refuge with him. He received them all, and while they were in the coffer, Zeus inspired them with reciprocal amity, which prevented their devouring one another. In this manner, shut up within one single coffer, they floated as long as the waters remained in force. Such is the account given by the Greeks of Deucalion. But to this, which they equally tell, the people of Hierapolis add a marvellous narrative, that in their country a great chasm opened, into which all the waters of the deluge poured. Then Deucalion raised an altar, and dedicated a temple to Hera Atargatis, close to this very chasm. I have seen it. It is very narrow, and situated under the temple. Whether it was once large and has now shrunk, I do not know, but I have seen it, and it is quite small. In memory of the event, the following is the rite accomplished. Twice a year sea water is brought to the temple. This is not only done by the priests, but numerous pilgrims come from the whole of Syria and Arabia, and even from beyond the Euphrates, bringing water. It is poured out in the temple, and goes into the cleft, which, narrow as it is, swallows up a considerable quantity. This is said to be in virtue of religious law instituted by Deucalion to preserve the memory of the catastrophe, and of the benefits that he received from the gods. Such is the ancient tradition of the temple. It appears to me difficult, says Lenormant, not to recognize an echo of fables popular in all Semitic countries about this chasm of Hierapolis, and the part it played in the deluge, in the enigmatic expressions of the Koran respecting the oven (tanur), which began to bubble and disgorge water all around at the commencement of the deluge. We know that this tanur has been the occasion of most grotesque imaginings of Mussulman commentators, who had lost the tradition of the story to which Mohammed made allusion. And moreover, the Koran formally states that the waters of the deluge were absorbed in the bosom of the earth. Here the Xisuthros of Berosus becomes Deucalion Sisythes. The animals are not collected together by Deucalion, as in the case of Noah and Khasisatra, but they crowded into the vessel of their own accord, driven by the terror with which the storm had inspired them. As in great calamities, the creatures of the forest have been known to seek refuge in the houses of men. India affords us an account of the deluge, which, by its poverty, strikingly contrasts with that of the Bible and the Chaldeans. Its most simple and ancient form is found in the Satapatha Brahmana of the Rig Veda. It has been translated for the first time by Max Müller. One morning, water for washing was brought to Manu, and when he had washed himself, a fish remained in his hands, and it addressed these words to him: "Protect me, and I will save thee." "From what wilt thou save me?" A deluge will sweep all creatures away. It is from that I will save thee." "How shall I protect thee?" The fish replied, "While we are small we run great dangers, for fish swallow fish. Keep me at first in a vase. When I become too large for it, dig a basin to put me in. When I shall have grown still more, throw me into the ocean. Then I shall be preserved from destruction." Soon it grew a large fish. It said to Mann, "The very year I shall have reached my full growth, the deluge will happen. Then build a vessel and worship me. When the waters rise, enter the vessel, and I will save thee." After keeping him thus, Mann carried the fish to the sea. In the year indicated, Mann built a vessel and worshipped the fish, and when the deluge came he entered the vessel. Then the fish came swimming up to him, and Mann fastened the cable of the ship to the horn of the fish, by which means the latter made it pass over the mountain of the north. The fish said, "I have saved thee. Fasten the vessel to a tree, that the water may not sweep it away while thou art on the mountain, and in proportion as the waters decrease thou shalt descend." Mann descended with the waters, and this is what is called the descent of Mann on the mountain of the north. The deluge had carried away all creatures, and Mann remained alone. There is another form of the Hindu legend in the Puranas. Lenormant says, "We must also remark that in the Puranas it is no longer Manu Vaivasata that the divine fish saves from the deluge, but a different personage, the king of the Dastas, i.e. fisher, Satiravata, the man who loves justice and truth, strikingly corresponding to the Chaldean Khasisatra. Nor is the Puranic version of the legend of the deluge to be despised, though it be of recent date, and full of fantastic and often puerile details. In certain aspects it is less Aryanized than that of the Brahmana or than the Mahabharata, and above all it gives some circumstances omitted in these earlier versions, which must yet have belonged to the original foundation, since they appear in the Babylonian legend, a circumstance preserved, no doubt, by the oral tradition, popular and not Brahmanic, with which the Puranas are so deeply imbued. This has already been observed by Pictet, who lays due stress on the following passage of the Bhagavata Purana. "In 7 days, said Vishnu to Satiravata, the 3 worlds shall be submerged. There is nothing like this in the Brahmana nor the Mahabharata, but in Genesis the Lord said to Noah, Yet 7 days, and I will cause it to rain upon the earth. And a little farther we read, After 7 days the waters of the flood were upon the earth. Nor must we pay less attention to the directions given by the fish god to Satiravata for the placing of the sacred scriptures in a safe place, in order to preserve them from the Hayagriva, a marine horse dwelling in the abyss. We recognize in it, under an Indian garb, the very tradition of the interment of the sacred writings at Sippara by Khasisatra, such as we have seen it in the fragment of Berosus. The references to the 3 worlds and the fish god in these legends point to Atlantis. The 3 worlds probably refers to the great empire of Atlantis, described by Plato, to wit, the western continent America, the eastern continent Europe and Africa considered as one, and the island of Atlantis. As we have seen, Poseidon, the founder of the civilization of Atlantis, is identical with Neptune, who is always represented riding a dolphin, bearing a trident or 3-pronged symbol in his hand, emblematic probably of the triple kingdom. He is thus a sea god or fish god, and he comes to save the representative of his country. And we have also a new and singular form of the legend in the following. Lenormant says, "Among the Iranians, in the sacred books containing the fundamental Zoroastrian doctrines, and dating very far back, we meet with a tradition which must assuredly be looked upon as a variety of that of the Deluge, though possessing a special character and diverging in some essential particulars from those we have been examining. It relates how Yima, who in the original and primitive conception was the father of the human race, was warned by Ahura Mazda, the good deity, of the earth being about to be devastated by a flood. The god ordered Yima to construct a refuge, a square garden, vara, protected by an enclosure, and to cause the germs of men, beasts, and plants to enter it, in order to escape annihilation. Accordingly, when the inundation occurred, the garden of Yima, with all that it contained, was alone spared, and the message of safety was brought thither by the bird Karshipta, the envoy of Ahura Mazda." Venudid, Vol. 2, p. 46. This clearly signifies that prior to the destruction of Atlantis a colony had been sent out to some neighbouring country. These emigrants built a walled town, and brought to it the grains and domestic animals of the mother country, and when the island of Atlantis sunk in the ocean, a messenger brought the terrible tidings to them in a ship. The Greeks had two principal legends as to the cataclysm by which primitive humanity was destroyed. The first was connected with the name of Ogyges, the most ancient of the kings of Boeotia or Attica, a quite mythical personage, lost in the night of ages, his very name seemingly derived from one signifying deluge in Aryan idioms, in Sanskrit Anga. It is said that in his time the whole land was covered by a flood, whose waters reached the sky, and from which he, together with some companions, escaped in a vessel. The second tradition is the Thessalian legend of Deucalion. Zeus, having worked to destroy the men of the age of bronze, with whose crimes he was wroth, Deucalion, by the advice of Prometheus, his father, constructed a coffer in which he took refuge with his wife Pyrrha. The deluge came, the chest or coffer floated at the mercy of the waves for 9 days and 9 nights, and was finally stranded on Mount Parnassus. Deucalion and Pyrrha leave it, offer sacrifice, and, according to the command of Zeus, repeople the world by throwing behind them the bones of the earth, namely, stones, which change into men. This deluge of Deucalion is, in Grecian tradition, what most resembles a universal deluge. Many authors affirm that it extended to the whole earth, and that the whole human race perished. At Athens, in memory of the event, and to appease the manes of its victims, a ceremony called hydrophoria was observed, having so close a resemblance to that in use at Hierapolis, in Syria, that we can hardly fail to look upon it as a Syro-Phoenician importation, and the result of an assimilation established in remote antiquity between the deluge of Deucalion and that of Khasisatra, as described by the author of the treatise on the Syrian goddess. Close to the temple of the Olympian Zeus, a fissure in the soil was shown, in length but 1 cubit, through which it was said the waters of the deluge had been swallowed up. Thus every year, on the 3rd day of the festival of Anthesteria, a day of mourning consecrated to the dead, that is, on the 13th of the month of Anthesterion, toward the beginning of March, it was customary, as at Bambyce, to pour water into the fissure, together with flour mixed with honey, poured also into the trench dug to the west of the tomb in the funeral sacrifices of the Athenians. In this legend also there are passages which point to Atlantis. We will see hereafter that the Greek god Zeus was one of the kings of Atlantis. The men of the age of bronze indicates the civilization of the doomed people. They were the great metallurgists of their day, who, as we will see, were probably the source of the great number of implements and weapons of bronze found all over Europe. Here also, while no length of time is assigned to the duration of the storm, we find that the ark floated but 9 days and nights. Noah was 1 year and 10 days in the ark. Khasisatra was not half that time, while Deucalion was afloat only 9 days. At Megara, in Greece, it was the eponym of the city Megaros, son of Zeus and one of the nymphs, Sithnides, who, warned by the cry of cranes of the imminence of the danger of the coming flood, took refuge on Mount Geranien. Again, there was the Thessalian Cerambos, who was said to have escaped the flood by rising into the air on wings given him by the nymphs, and it was Perirrhus, son of Aeolus, that Zeus Naios had preserved at Dodona. For the inhabitants of the Isle of Kos, the hero of the deluge was Merops, son of Hyas, who there assembled under his rule the remnant of humanity preserved with him. The traditions of Rhodes only suppose the Telchines, those of Crete's Sasion, to have escaped the cataclysm. In Samothracia the same character was attributed to Saon, said to be the son of Zeus or of Hermes. It will be observed that in all these legends the name of Zeus, king of Atlantis, reappears. It would appear probable that many parties had escaped from the catastrophe, and had landed at the different points named in the traditions, or else that colonies had already been established by the Atlanteans at those places. It would appear impossible that a maritime people could be totally destroyed. Doubtless many were on shipboard in the harbours, and others going and coming on distant voyages. The invasion of the East, says Baldwin (Prehistoric Nations, p. 396), to which the story of Atlantis refers, seems to have given rise to the Panathenae, the oldest, greatest, and most splendid festivals in honour of Athena celebrated in Attica. These festivals are said to have been established by Erychthonus in the most ancient times remembered by the historical traditions of Athens. Burke says of them, in his commentary on Plato, "In the greater Panathenæ there was carried in procession a peplum of Minerva, representing the war with the giants and the victory of the gods of Olympus. In the lesser Panathenæ they carried another peplum, covered with symbolic devices, which showed how the Athenians, supported by Minerva, had the advantage in the war with the Atlantis." A scholia quoted from Proclus by Humboldt and Burke says, "The historians who speak of the islands of the exterior sea tell us that in their time there were 7 islands consecrated to Proserpine, and 3 others of immense extent, of which the first was consecrated to Pluto, the second to Ammon, and the third to Neptune. The inhabitants of the latter had preserved a recollection, transmitted to them by their ancestors, of the island of Atlantis, which was extremely large, and for a long time held sway over all the islands of the Atlantic Ocean. Atlantis was also consecrated to Neptune." See Humboldt's Histoire de la Géographie du Nouveau Continent, vol. I. No one can read these legends and doubt that the flood was an historical reality. It is impossible that in 2 different places in the Old World, remote from each other, religious ceremonies should have been established and perpetuated from age to age in memory of an event which never occurred. We have seen that at Athens and Hierapolis in Syria, pilgrims came from a distance to appease the god of the earthquake by pouring offerings into fissures of the earth, said to have been made at the time Atlantis was destroyed. More than this, we know from Plato's history that the Athenians long preserved in their books the memory of a victory won over the Atlanteans in the early ages, and celebrated it by national festivals, with processions and religious ceremonies. It is too much to ask us to believe that Biblical history, Chaldean, Iranian, and Greek legends signify nothing, and that even religious pilgrimages and national festivities were based upon a myth. I would call attention to the farther fact that in the Deluge legend of the Isle of Cos the hero of the affair was Merops. Now we have seen that according to Theopompus one of the names of the people of Atlantis was Meropes. But we have not reached the end of our flood legends. The Persian Magi possessed a tradition in which the waters issued from the oven of an old woman. Mohammed borrowed this story, and in the Koran he refers to the Deluge as coming from an oven. All men were drowned save Noah and his family, and then God said, "O earth, swallow up thy waters, and thou, O heaven, withhold thy rain." And immediately the waters abated. In the bardic poems of Wales we have a tradition of the Deluge which, although recent, under the concise forms of the triads, is still deserving of attention. As usual, the legend is localized in the country, and the Deluge counts among 3 terrible catastrophes of the island of Prydian, or Britain, the other 2 consisting of devastation by fire and by drought. The first of these events, it is said, was the eruption of Gingilion, or the Lake of Waves, and the inundation (bavd) of the whole country, by which all mankind was drowned, with the exception of Dvifam and Dvifach, who saved themselves in a vessel without rigging, and it was by them that the island of Prydian was repeopled. Pictet here observes, "Although the triads in their actual form hardly date farther than the 13th or 14th century, some of them are undoubtedly connected with very ancient traditions, and nothing here points to a borrowing from Genesis." But it is not so, perhaps, with another triad, speaking of the vessel Nephidnaf Nephion, which at the time of the overflow of Gion bore a pair of all living creatures, and rather too much resembles the Ark of Noah. The very name of the patriarch may have suggested this triple epithet, obscure as to its meaning, but evidently formed on the principle of Cymric alliteration. In the same triad we have the enigmatic story of the horned oxen, Uchain Banog, of Hu the Mighty, who drew out of Gion the Avanc (beaver or crocodile) in order that the lake should not overflow. The meaning of these enigmas could only be hoped from deciphering the chaos of barbaric monuments of the Welsh Middle Age, but meanwhile we cannot doubt that the Cymri possessed an indigenous tradition of the Deluge. We also find a vestige of the same tradition in the Scandinavian Ealda. Here the story is combined with the cosmogonic myth. The 3 sons of Bor, Otin, Vili, and Ve, grandsons of Buri, the first man, slay Ymir, the father of the Hrimthursar, or ice giants, and his body serves them for the construction of the world. Blood flows from his wounds in such abundance that all the race of giants is drowned in it except Bergelmir, who saves himself with his wife in a boat and reproduces the race. In the Edda of Zimund, the Vala's prophecy, we seem to catch traditional glimpses of a terrible catastrophe, which reminds us of the Chaldean legend. Then trembles Yggdrasil's ash yet standing, groans that ancient tree, and the Jötun Loki is loosed. The shadows groan on the ways of Hel, the goddess of death, until the fire of Surt has consumed the tree. Hyrm steers from the east, the waters rise, the mundane snake is coiled in Jötun rage. The worm beats the water and the eagle screams, the pale of beak tears carcasses, the ship Nalgfar is loosed. Surt from the south comes with flickering flame, shines from his sword the Valgod's sun. The stony hills are dashed together, the giantesses totter, men tread the path of Hel, and heaven is cloven. The sun darkens, earth in ocean sinks, fall from heaven the bright stars, fire's breath assails the all-nourishing, towering fire plays against heaven itself. Egypt does not contain a single allusion to the flood. Lenormant says, "While the tradition of the Deluge holds so considerable a place in the legendary memories of all branches of the Aryan race, the monuments and original texts of Egypt, with their many cosmogonic speculations, have not afforded one even distant allusion to this cataclysm. When the Greeks told the Egyptian priests of the Deluge of Deucalion, their reply was that they had been preserved from it as well as from the conflagration produced by Phaethon. They even added that the Hellenes were childish in attaching so much importance to that event, as there had been several other local catastrophes resembling it. According to a passage in Manetho, much suspected, however, of being an interpolation, Thoth, or Hermes Trismegistus, had himself, before the cataclysm, inscribed on stelae, in hieroglyphical and sacred language, the principles of all knowledge. After it, the second Thoth translated into the vulgar tongue the contents of these stelae. This would be the only Egyptian mention of the Deluge, the same Manetho not speaking of it in what remains to us of his Dynasties, his only complete authentic work. The silence of all other myths of the Pharaonic religion on this head render it very likely that the above is merely a foreign tradition, recently introduced, and no doubt of Asiatic and Chaldean origin. To my mind, the explanation of this singular omission is very plain. The Egyptians had preserved in their annals the precise history of the destruction of Atlantis, out of which the flood legends grew; and, as they told the Greeks, there had been no universal flood, but only local catastrophes. Possessing the real history of the local catastrophe which destroyed Atlantis, they did not indulge in any myths about a universal deluge covering the mountain tops of all the world. They had no Ararat in their neighbourhood. The traditions of the early Christian ages touching the Deluge pointed to the quarter of the world in which Atlantis was situated. There was a quaint old monk named Cosmas, who about 1000 years ago published a book, Topographia Christiana, accompanied by a map in which he gives his view of the world as it was then understood. It was a body surrounded by water, and resting on nothing. The earth, says Cosmos, presses downward, but the igneous parts tend upward, and between the conflicting forces the earth hangs suspended, like Mohammed's coffin in the old story. The accompanying illustration, page 95, represents the earth surrounded by the ocean, and beyond this ocean was the land where men dwelt before the deluge. He then gives us a more accurate map in detail of the known world of his day. I copy this map not to show how much more we know than poor Cosmos, but because he taught that all around this habitable world there was yet another world, adhering closely on all sides to the circumscribing walls of heaven. Upon the eastern side of this transmarine land he judges man was created, and that there the paradise of gladness was located, such as here on the eastern edge is described, where it received our first parents, driven out of paradise, to that extreme point of land on the sea-shore. Hence, upon the coming of the deluge, Noah and his sons were borne by the ark to the earth we now inhabit. The 4 rivers he supposes to be gushing up the spouts of paradise. They are depicted on the above map. O is the Mediterranean Sea, P the Arabian Gulf, L the Caspian Sea, Q the Tigris, M the river Pison, and J the land where men dwelt before the flood. It will be observed that while he locates paradise in the east, he places the scene of the deluge in the west, and he supposes that Noah came from the scene of the deluge to Europe. This shows that the traditions in the time of Cosmos looked to the west as the place of the deluge, and that after the deluge Noah came to the shores of the Mediterranean. The fact, too, that there was land in the west beyond the ocean is recognized by Cosmos, and is probably a dim echo from Atlantean times. The following rude cut from Cosmos represents the high mountain in the north, behind which the sun hid himself at night, thus producing the alternations of day and night. His solar majesty is just getting behind the mountain, while Luna looks calmly on at the operation. The mountain is as crooked as Culhuacan, the crooked mountain of Aztlan described by the Aztecs. End of chapter 4.
Part 2, Chapter 5 of Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Harris. Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. Chapter 5. The Deluge Legends of America. "It's a very remarkable fact," says Alfred Maury, "that we find in America traditions of the Deluge coming infinitely nearer to that of the Bible and the Chaldean religion than among any people of the Old World. It's difficult to suppose that the emigration that certainly took place from Asia into North America by the Kurile and Aleutian Islands, and still does so in our day, should have brought in these memories, since no trace is found of them among those Mongol or Siberian populations which were fused with the natives of the New World. The attempts that have been made to trace the origin of Mexican civilization to Asia have not as yet led to any sufficiently conclusive facts. Besides, had Buddhism, which we doubt, made its way into America, it could not have introduced a myth not found in its own scriptures. The cause of these similarities between the Diluvian traditions of the nations of the New World and that of the Bible remains therefore unexplained. The cause of these similarities can be easily explained. The legends of the Flood did not pass into America by way of the Aleutian Islands, or through the Buddhists of Asia, but were derived from an actual knowledge of Atlantis, possessed by the people of America. Atlantis and the western continent had from an immemorial age held intercourse with each other. The great nations of America were simply colonies from Atlantis, sharing in its civilization, language, religion, and blood. From Mexico to the peninsula of Yucatan, from the shores of Brazil to the heights of Bolivia and Peru, from the Gulf of Mexico to the headwaters of the Mississippi River, the colonies of Atlantis extended, and therefore it is not strange to find, as Alfred Maury says, American traditions of the Deluge coming nearer to that of the Bible and the Chaldean record than those of any people of the Old World. The most important among the American traditions are the Mexican, for they appear to have been definitively fixed by symbolic and mnemonic paintings before any contact with Europeans. According to these documents, the Noah of the Mexican cataclysm was Coxcox, called by certain people Teocipitli or Tezpi. He had saved himself, together with his wife Xochiquetzal, in a bark, or, according to other traditions, on a raft made of cypress wood, Cupressus destaca. Paintings retracing the deluge of Coxcox have been discovered among the Aztecs, Miztecs, Zapotecs, Tlaxcaltecs, and Mexicaneses. The tradition of the latter is still more strikingly in conformity with the story as we have it in Genesis and in Chaldean sources. It tells how Tezpi embarked in a spacious vessel with his wife, his children, and several animals, and grain, whose preservation was essential to the subsistence of the human race. When the great god Tezcatlipoca decreed that the waters should retire, Tezpi sent a vulture from the bark. The bird, feeding on the carcasses with which the earth was laden, did not return. Tezpi sent out other birds, of which the humming-bird only came back with a leafy branch in its beak. Then Tezpi, seeing that the country began to vegetate, left his bark on the mountain of Colhacoan. The document, however, that gives the most valuable information, says Lenormant, as to the cosmogony of the Mexicans is one known as Codex Vaticanus, from the library where it is preserved. It consists of 4 symbolic pictures representing the 4 ages of the world preceding the actual one. They were copied by Chobula from a manuscript anterior to the conquest, and accompanied by the explanatory commentary of Pedro de los Rios, a Dominican monk, who in 1566, less than 50 years after the arrival of Cortez, devoted himself to the research of indigenous traditions as being necessary to his missionary work. There were, according to this document, 4 ages of the world. The first was an age of giants, the great mammalia, who were destroyed by famine. The second age ended in a conflagration. The third age was an age of monkeys. Then comes the fourth age, Antonotwi, son of water, whose number is 10 times 400 plus 8, or 4008. It ends by a great inundation, a veritable deluge. All mankind are changed into fish, with the exception of one man and his wife, who save themselves in a bark made of the trunk of a cypress tree. The picture represents Matlaque, goddess of waters, and consort of Tlaloc, god of rain, as darting down toward earth. Coxcox and Xochiquetzal, the 2 human beings preserved, are seen seated on a tree trunk and floating in the midst of the waters. This flood is represented as the last cataclysm that devastates the earth. The learned Abbé Brasseur de Bourbourg translates from the Aztec language of the Codex Chimalpopoca the following flood legend: "This is the sun called Nahuatl, for water. Now the water was tranquil for 40 years plus 12, and the men lived for the third and fourth times. When the sun Nahuatl came there had passed away 400 years plus 2 ages plus 76 years. Then all mankind was lost and drowned, and found themselves changed into fish. The sky came nearer the water. In a single day all was lost, and the day Nahuatl, 4 flower, destroyed all our flesh. And that year was that of Checale, 1 house, and the day Nahuatl all was lost. Even the mountains sunk into the water, and the water remained tranquil for 52 springs. Now at the end of the year the god Titlacahuan had warned Nata and his spouse Nina, saying, 'Make no more wine of agave, but begin to hollow out a great cypress, and you will enter into it when in the month Tozdantli the water approaches the sky.' Then they entered in, and when the god had closed the door, he said, 'Thou shalt eat but 1 ear of maize, and thy wife 1 also.' But as soon as they had finished they went out, and the water remained calm, for the wood no longer moved, and on opening it they began to see fish. Then they lit a fire by rubbing together pieces of wood, and they roasted fish. The god Quitalanque and Citalantanang instantly looked down, said, 'Divine Lord, what is that fire that is making there? Why do they thus smoke the sky?' At once Titlacahuan Tezcatlipoca descended. He began to chide, saying, 'Who has made this fire here?' And seizing hold of the fish, he shaped their loins and heads, and they were transformed into dogs. Chichim. Here we note a remarkable approximation to Plato's account of the destruction of Atlantis. 'In one day and one fatal night,' says Plato, 'there came mighty earthquakes and inundations that engulfed that warlike people. In a single day all was lost,' says the Aztec legend. And instead of a rainfall of 40 days and 40 nights, as represented in the Bible, here we see, 'In a single day even the mountains sunk into the water.' Not only the land on which the people dwelt, who were turned into fish, but the very mountains of that land sunk into the water. Does not this describe the fate of Atlantis? In the Chaldean legend, the great goddess Ishtar wailed like a child, saying, 'I am the mother who gave birth to men, and, like to the race of fishes, they are filling the sea.' In the account in Genesis, Noah builded an altar unto the Lord, and took of every clean beast and of every clean fowl, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And the Lord smelled a sweet savour, and the Lord said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake. In the Chaldean legend we are told that Kashsistra also offered a sacrifice, a burnt offering, and the gods assembled like flies above the master of the sacrifice. But Bel came in a high state of indignation, just as the Aztec god did, and was about to finish the work of the deluge, when the great god Ea took pity in his heart and interfered to save the remnant of mankind. These resemblances cannot be accidental, neither can they be the interpolations of Christian missionaries, for it will be observed the Aztec legends differ from the Bible in points where they resemble, on the one hand, Plato's record, and on the other, the Chaldean legend. The name of the hero of the Aztec story, Nata, pronounced with the broad sound of the A, is not far from the name of Noah, or Noe. The deluge of Genesis is a Phoenician, Semitic, or Hebraic legend, and yet, strange to say, the name of Noah, which occurs in it, bears no appropriate meaning in those tongues, but is derived from Aryan sources. Its fundamental root is Na, to which in all the Aryan language is attached the meaning of water, Greek nain, to flow, Greek nama, water, Nympha, Neptunus, water deities. Lenormant and Chevalier, Ancient History of the East, Vol. 1, page 15. We find the root Na repeated in the name of this Central American Noah, Nata, and probably in the word Nahuatl, the age of water. But still more striking analogies exist between the Chaldean legend and the story of the deluge, as told in the Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Central Americans. Then the waters were agitated by the will of the heart of heaven, Huracan, and a great inundation came upon the heads of these creatures. They were engulfed, and a resinous thickness descended from heaven. The face of the earth was obscured, and a heavy darkening rain commenced, rain by day and rain by night. There was heard a great noise above their heads, as if produced by fire. Then there were men seen running, pushing each other, filled with despair. They wished to climb upon their houses, and the houses, tumbling down, fell to the ground. They wished to climb upon the trees, and the trees shook them off. They wished to enter into the grottos, eaves, and the grottos closed themselves before them. Water and fire contributed to the universal ruin at the time of the last great cataclysm which preceded the fourth creation. Observe the similarities here to the Chaldean legend. There is the same graphic description of a terrible event. The black cloud is referred to in both instances. Also the dreadful noises, the rising water, the earthquake rocking the trees, overturning the houses, and crushing even the mountain caverns. The men running and pushing each other, filled with despair, says the Popol Vuh. The brother no longer saw his brother, says the Assyrian legend. And here I may note that this word Huracan, the spirit of the abyss, the god of storm, the hurricane, is very suggestive, and testifies to an early intercourse between the opposite shores of the Atlantic. We find in Spanish the word huracan, in Portuguese furacan, in French uragan, in German, Danish, and Swedish orkan, all of them signifying a storm, while in Latin furo or furio means to rage. And are not the old Swedish hurra, to be driven along, our own word hurried? The Icelandic word hurra, to be rattled over frozen ground, all derived from the same root from which the god of the abyss, Huracan, obtained his name? The last thing a people forgets is the name of their god. We retain to this day in the names of the days of the week the designations of 4 Scandinavian gods and 1 Roman deity. It seems to me certain the above are simply 2 versions of the same event, that while ships from Atlantis carried terrified passengers to tell the story of the dreadful catastrophe to the people of the Mediterranean shores, other ships flying from the tempest bore similar awful tidings to the civilized races around the Gulf of Mexico. The native Mexican historian Ixtlilxochitl gave this as the Toltec legend of the flood. It is found in the histories of the Toltecs that this age and first world, as they called it, lasted 1,716 years, and that men were destroyed by tremendous rains and lightning from the sky, and even all the land, without the exception of anything, and the highest mountains, were covered up and submerged in water 15 cubits deep, Caxtolmolotli. And here they added other fables of how men came to multiply from the few who escaped from this destruction, in Atotlipetlakalli, that this word nearly signifies a close chest, and how, after men had multiplied, they erected a very high Zaquali, which is today a tower of great height, in order to take refuge in it should the second world or age be destroyed. Presently their languages were confused, and not being able to understand each other, they went to different parts of the earth. The Toltecs, consisting of 7 friends with their wives, who understood the same language, came to these parts, having first passed great land and seas, having lived in caves, and having endured great hardships in order to reach this land. They wandered 104 years through different parts of the world before they reached Huehuetlapalan, which is in Chetecpatl, 520 years after the flood. It will, of course, be said that this account, in those particulars where it agrees with the Bible, was derived from the teachings of the Spanish priests. But it must be remembered that Ixtlilxochitl was an Indian, a native of Tezuoco, a son of the queen, and that his relaciones were drawn from the archives of his family and the ancient writings of his nation. He had no motive to falsify documents that were probably in the hands of hundreds at that time. Here we see that the depth of the water over the earth, 15 cubits, given in the Toltec legend, is precisely the same as that named in the Bible. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail. That from Genesis chapter 7, page 20. In the 2 curious picture histories of the Aztecs, preserved in Botarini collection, and published by Gemelli Carreri and others, there is a record of their migrations from their original location through various parts of the North American continent until their arrival in Mexico. In both cases their starting point is an island, from which they pass in a boat, and the island contains in one case a mountain, and in the other a high temple in the midst thereof. These things seem to be reminiscences of their origin in Atlantis. In each case we see the crooked mountain of the Aztec legends, the Colcoacan, looking not unlike the bent mountain of the monk Cosmas. In the legends of the Chibchas of Bogota we seem to have distinct reminiscences of Atlantis. Bochica was their leading divinity. During 2,000 years he employed himself in elevating his subjects. He lived in the sun, while his wife Chia occupied the moon. This would appear to be an allusion to the worship of the sun and moon. Beneath Bochica, in their mythology, was Chibchuan. In an angry mood, he brought a deluge on the people of the tableland. Bochica punished him for this act, and obliged him ever after, like Atlas, to bear the burden of the earth on his back. Occasionally he shifts the earth from one shoulder to another, and this causes earthquakes. Here we have allusions to an ancient people who during thousands of years were elevated in the scale of civilization and were destroyed by a deluge, and with this is associated an Atlantean god bearing the world on his back. We find even the rainbow appearing in connection with this legend. When Bochica appeared in answer to prayer to quell the deluge, he is seated on a rainbow. He opened a breach in the earth at Tequendama, through which the waters of the flood escaped, precisely as we have seen them disappearing through the crevice in the earth near Bambis in Greece. The Toltecs traced their migrations back to a starting point called Aztlan, or Atlan. This could be no other than Atlantis. This from Bancroft's Native Races, Volume 5, page 221. The original home of the Nahuatlacas was Aztlan, the location of which has been the subject of much discussion. The causes that led to their exodus from that country can only be conjectured, but they may be supposed to have been driven out by their enemies, for Aztlan is described as a land too fair and beautiful to be left willingly in the mere hope of finding a better. Again from Bancroft. The Aztecs also claim to have come originally from Aztlan. Their very name, Aztecs, was derived from Aztlan, and they were Atlanteans. The Popul Vuh tells us that after the migration from Aztlan, 3 sons of the king of the Quiches, upon the death of their father, determined to go as their fathers had ordered to the east, on the shores of the sea whence their fathers had come, to receive the royalty, bidding adieu to their brothers and friends, and promising to return. Doubtless they passed over the sea when they went to the east to receive the royalty. Now this is the name of the lord, of the monarch of the people of the east, where they went. And when they arrived before the Lord Nakchit, the name of the great Lord, the only judge, whose power was without limit, behold, he granted them the sign of royalty and all that represents it, and the insignia of royalty, all the things, in fact, which they brought on their return, and which they went to receive from the other side of the sea, the art of painting from Toulon, a system of writing, they said, for the things recorded in their histories, is from Bancroft's Native Races, Volume 5, page 553, and the Popple Vuh, page 294. This legend not only points to the East as the place of origin of these races, but also proves that this land of the East, this Aztlan, this Atlantis, exercised dominion over the colonies in Central America, and furnished them with the essentials of civilization. How completely does this agree with the statement of Plato that the kings of Atlantis held a dominion over parts of the great opposite continent! Professor Valentini, in Maya Archaeology, page 23, describes an Aztec picture in the work of Gemelli, Il Giro del Mondo, volume 6, of the migration of the Aztecs from Aztlan. Out of a sheet of water there projects the beak of a mountain. On it stands a tree, and on the tree a bird spreads its wings. At the foot of the mountain peak there comes out of the water the heads of a man and a woman. The one wears on his head the symbol of his name, cox cox, a pheasant. The other head bears that of a hand with a bouquet, Xochitl, a flower, and Quetzal, shining in green gold. In the foreground is a boat, out of which a naked man stretches out his hand imploringly to heaven. Now turn to the sculpture in the flood tablet on the great calendar stone. There you will find represented the flood, and with great emphasis by the accumulation of all those symbols with which the ancient Mexicans conveyed the idea of water: a tub of standing water, drops springing out, not two, as heretofore in the symbol for Atl, water, but 4 drops, the picture for moisture, a snail; above, a crocodile, the king of the rivers. In the midst of these symbols you notice the profile of a man with a fillet, and a smaller one of a woman. There can be no doubt these are the Mexican Noah, Cox Cox, and his wife, Xochquetzal, and at the same time it is evident, the calendar stone we know was made in A.D. 1478, that the story of them, and the pictures representing the story, have not been invented by the Catholic clergy, but really existed among those nations long before the Conquest. The above figure represents the flood tablets on the great calendar stone. When we turn to the uncivilized Indians of America, while we still find legends referring to the Deluge, they are, with one exception, in such garbled and uncouth forms that we can only see glimpses of the truth shining through a mass of fable. The following tradition was current among the Indians of the Great Lakes. In former times the father of the Indian tribes dwelt toward the rising sun. Having been warned in a dream that a deluge was coming upon the earth, he built a raft on which he saved himself, with his family and all the animals. He floated thus for several months. The animals, who at that time spoke, loudly complained and murmured against him. At last a new earth appeared, on which he landed with all the animals, who from that time lost the power of speech as a punishment for their murmurs against their deliverer. According to Father Charlevoix, the tribes of Canada and the valley of the Mississippi relate in their rude legends that all mankind was destroyed by a flood, and that the Good Spirit, to repeople the earth, had changed animals into man. It is to J.S. Cole we owe our acquaintance with the version of the Chippewas, full of grotesque and perplexing touches, in which the man saved from the deluge is called Menaboshu. To know if the earth be drying, he sends a bird, the diver, out of his bark, then becomes the restorer of the human race and the founder of the existing society. A clergyman who visited the Indians northwest of the Ohio in 1764 met at a treaty a party of Indians from the west of the Mississippi. They informed him that one of their most ancient traditions was that a great while ago they had a common father, who lived toward the rising of the sun, and governed the whole world; that all the white people's heads were under his feet; that he had 12 sons by whom he administered the government; that the 12 sons behaved very badly, and tyrannized over the people, abusing their power; that the Great Spirit, being thus angry with them, suffered the white people to introduce spirituous liquors among them, made them drunk, stole the special gift of the Great Spirit from them, and by this means usurped power over them, and ever since the Indians' heads were under the white people's feet. This from Boudonnau's Star in the West, page 111. Here we note that they looked toward the rising sun, toward Atlantis, for the original home of their race; that this region governed the whole world; that it contained white people, who were at first a subject race, but who subsequently rebelled and acquired dominion over the darker races. We will see reason hereafter to conclude that Atlantis had a composite population, and that the rebellion of the Titans in Greek mythology was the rising up of a subject population. End of Chapter 5, Section 12, Part 2. Recording by Mike Harris. 13, Part 2, The Deluge, Chapter 5, of Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Harris. Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly, Chapter 5. In 1836, C.S. Rafinesque published in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a work called The American Nations, in which he gives the historical songs or chants of the Lenape or Delaware Indians, the tribe that originally dwelt along the Delaware River. After describing a time when there was nothing but sea water on top of the land, and the creation of sun, moon, stars, earth, and man, the legend depicts the Golden Age and the Fall in these words: "All were willingly pleased, all were easy thinking, all were well happified. But after a while a snake priest, Awako, brings on earth secretly the snake worship, Inetako, of the god of the snakes, Wakon. And there came wickedness, crime, and unhappiness, and bad weather was coming, distemper was coming, with death was coming. All this happened very long ago at the first land, Netamaki, beyond the great ocean, Kitahikahu." Then follows the Song of the Flood. "There was long ago a powerful snake, Maskanako, when the men had become bad beings, Makowini. This strong snake had become the foe of the Jinns, and they became troubled, hating each other. Both were fighting, both were spoiling, both were never peaceful. And they were fighting, least man Matapawi with dead keeper Nikhawlawit, and the strong snake readily resolved to destroy or fight the beings, or the men. The dark snake he brought, the monster, Ananyam, he brought, snake rushing water he brought it. Much water is rushing, much go to hills, much penetrate, much destroying. Meanwhile, at Tula, this is the same Tula referred to in the Central American legends, at that island, Nanabush, the great hare Nana, became the ancestor of beings and men. Being born creeping, he is ready to move and dwell at Tula. The beings and men all go forth from the flood, creeping in shallow water or swimming afloat, asking which is the way to the turtle back, Tulapin. But there are many monsters in the way, and some men are devoured by them. But the daughter of a spirit helped them in a boat, saying, 'Come, come.' They were coming and were helped. The name of the boat or raft was Mokol. The water running off, it is drying, in the plains and the mountains at the path of the cave. Elsewhere went the powerful action or motion." Then follows Song No. 3, describing the condition of mankind after the flood. Like the Aryans, they moved into a cold country. "It freezes" was there, "it snows" was there, "it is cold" was there. They moved to a milder region to hunt cattle. They divided their forces into tillers and hunters. The good and the holy were the hunters. They were spread themselves north, south, east, and west. Meantime all the snakes were afraid in their huts, and the snake priest Nakopawa said to all, "Let us go." Eastwardly they go forth at Snakeland, Akokink, and they went away, earnestly grieving. Afterward the fathers of the Delawares, who were always boating and navigating, find that the snake people have taken possession of a fine country, and they collect together the people from north, south, east, and west, and attempt to pass over the waters of the frozen sea to possess that land. They seem to travel in the dark of an Arctic winter until they come to a gap of open sea. They can go no farther, but some tarry at Furland, while the rest return to where they started from, the old Turtle Land. Here we find that the land that was destroyed was the first land, that it was an island beyond the great ocean. In all early age the people were happy and peaceful. They became wicked. Snake worship was introduced, and was associated, as in Genesis, with the fall of man. Nanabush became the ancestor of the new race. His name reminds us of the Toltec Nata and the Hebrew Noah. After the flood came a dispersing of the people and a separation into hunters and tillers of the soil. Among the Mandan Indians we not only find flood legends, but, more remarkable still, we find an image of the ark, preserved from generation to generation, and a religious ceremony performed which refers plainly to the destruction of Atlantis, and to the arrival of one of those who escaped from the flood, bringing the dreadful tidings of the disaster. It must be remembered, as we will show hereafter, that many of these Mandan Indians were white men, with hazel, gray, and blue eyes, and all shades of color of the hair, from black to pure white; that they dwelt in houses in fortified towns, and manufactured earthenware pots in which they could boil water, an art unknown to the ordinary Indians, who boiled water by putting heated stones into it. I quote the very interesting account of George Catlin, who visited the Mandans nearly 50 years ago, lately republished in London in the North American Indians, a very curious and valuable work. He says in Volume 1, page 88, "In the center of the village is an open space, or public square, 150 feet in diameter and circular in form, which is used for all public games and festivals, shows, and exhibitions. The lodges around this open space front in with their doors toward the center, and in the middle of this stands an object of great religious veneration, on account of the importance it has in connection with the annual religious ceremonies. This object is in the form of a large hogshead, some 8 or 10 feet high, made of planks and hoops, containing within it some of their choicest mysteries or medicines. They call it the Big Canoe. This is a representation of the Ark. The ancient Jews venerated a similar image, and some of the ancient Greek states followed in processions a model of the Ark of Deucalion. But it is indeed surprising to find this practice perpetuated, even to our own times, by a race of Indians in the heart of America." On page 158 of the first volume of the same work, Catlin describes the great annual mysteries and religious ceremonials of which this image of the ark was the center. He says, "On the day set apart for the commencement of the ceremonies, a solitary figure is seen approaching the village. During the deafening din and confusion within the pickets of the village, the figure discovered on the prairie continued to approach with a dignified step, and in a right line toward the village. All eyes were upon him, and he at length made his appearance within the pickets, and proceeded toward the center of the village, where all the chiefs and braves stood ready to receive him, which they did in a cordial manner, by shaking hands, recognizing him as an old acquaintance, and pronouncing his name, Nu Mok Muk Ana, the first or only man. The body of this strange personage, which was chiefly naked, was painted with white clay, so as to resemble at a distance a white man. He enters the medicine lodge, and goes through certain mysterious ceremonies. During the whole of this day, Nu Mok Muk Ana, the first or only man, traveled through the village, stopping in front of each man's lodge, and crying until the owner of the lodge came out and asked who he was and what was the matter, to which he replied by narrating the sad catastrophe which had happened on the earth's surface by the overflowing of the waters, saying that he was the only person saved from the universal calamity, that he landed his big canoe on a high mountain in the west, where he now resides, that he has come to open the medicine lodge, which must needs receive a present of an edged tool from the owner of every wigwam, that it may be sacrificed to the water. For, he says, If this is not done, there will be another flood, and no one will be saved, as it was with such tools that the big canoe was made." Having visited every lodge in the village during the day, and having received such a present from each, as a hatchet, a knife, etc., which is undoubtedly always prepared ready for the occasion, he places them in the medicine lodge, and on the last day of the ceremony they are thrown into a deep place in the river, sacrificed to the spirit of the waters. Among the sacred articles kept in the great medicine lodge are 4 sacks of water, called ka, sewed together, each of them in the form of a tortoise lying on its back, with a bunch of eagle feathers attached to its tail. These 4 tortoises, they told me, contained the waters from the 4 quarters of the world, that those waters had been contained therein ever since the settling down of the waters. "I did not," says Catlin, who knew nothing of an Atlantis theory, "think it best to advance anything against such a ridiculous belief." Catlin tried to purchase one of these water sacks, but could not obtain it for any price. He was told they were "a society property." He then describes a dance by 12 men around the ark. They arrange themselves according to the 4 cardinal points. 2 are painted perfectly black, 2 are vermilion color, some were painted partially white. They dance a dance called Belloc na Pi, with horns on their heads, like those used in Europe as symbolical of Bel or Baal. Could anything be more evident than the connection of these ceremonies with the destruction of Atlantis? Here we have the image of the ark. Here we have a white man coming with the news that the waters had overflowed the land, and that all the people were destroyed except himself. Here we have the sacrifice to appease the spirit that caused the flood, just as we find the flood terminating, in the Hebrew, Chaldean, and Central American legends, with a sacrifice. Here, too, we have the image of the tortoise, which we find in other flood legends of the Indians, and which is a very natural symbol for an island. As one of our own poets has expressed it, "Very fair and full of promise lay the island of St. Thomas, like a great green turtle slumbered on the sea which it encumbered." Here we have, too, the 4 quarters of Atlantis, divided by its 4 rivers, as we shall see a little farther on, represented in a dance, where the dancers arrange themselves according to the 4 cardinal points of the compass. The dancers are painted to represent the black and red races, while the first and only man represents the white race, and the name of the dance is a reminiscence of Baal, the ancient god of the races derived from Atlantis. But this is not all. The Mandans were evidently of the race of Atlantis. They have another singular legend which we find in the account of Lewis and Clark. Their belief in a future state is connected with this theory of their origin. The whole nation resided in one large village, underground, near a subterranean lake. A grapevine extended its roots down to their habitation, and gave them a view of the light. Some of the most adventurous climbed up the vine, and were delighted with the sight of the earth, which they found covered with buffalo, and rich with every kind of fruit. Returning with the grapes they had gathered, their countrymen were so pleased with the taste of them that the whole nation resolved to leave their dull residence for the charms of the upper region. Men, women, and children ascended by means of the vine, but when about half the nation had reached the surface of the earth, a corpulent woman, who was clambering up the vine, broke it with her weight, and closed upon herself and the rest of the nation the light of the sun. This curious tradition means that the present nation dwelt in a large settlement underground, that is, beyond the land, in the sea being represented by the subterranean lake. At one time the people had free intercourse between this large village and the American continent, and they found extensive colonies on this continent, whereupon some mishap cut them off from the mother country. This explanation is confirmed by the fact that the legend of the Iowa Indians, who were a branch of the Dakotas, or Sioux Indians, and relatives of the Mandans, according to Major James W. Lynn, all the tribes of Indians were formerly one, and all dwelt together on an island, or at least across a large water toward the east or sunrise. They crossed this water in skin canoes or by swimming, but they know not how long they were in crossing, or whether the water was salt or fresh. While the Dakotas, according to Major Lind, who lived among them for 9 years, possessed legends of huge skiffs in which the Dakotas of old floated for weeks, finally gaining dry land, a reminiscence of ships and long sea voyages. The Mandans celebrated their great religious festival above described in the season when the willow is first in leaf, and a dove is mixed up in the ceremonies. And they further relate a legend that the world was once a great tortoise born on the waters and covered with earth, and that when one day, in digging the soil, a tribe of white men, who had made holes in the earth to a great depth, digging for badgers, at length pierced the shell of the tortoise, it sank, and the water covering it drowned all men with the exception of one, who saved himself in a boat, and when the earth re-emerged, sent out a dove, who returned with a branch of willow in its beak. The holes dug to find badgers were a savage's recollection of mining operations, and when the great disaster came, and the island sunk in the sea amid volcanic convulsions, doubtless men said it was due to the deep mines which had opened the way to the central fires. But the recurrence of white men as the miners, and of a white man as the last and only man, and the presence of white blood in the veins of the people, all point to the same conclusion, that the Mandans were colonists from Atlantis. And here I might add that Catlin found the following singular resemblances between the Mandan tongue and the Welsh.
English, I. Mandan, me. Welsh, me. Pronounced, me. English, you. Mandan, ne. Welsh, hui. Pronounced, hue. English, he. Mandan, Welsh, pronounced, English, she. Mandan, Welsh, pronounced, English, it. Mandan, aunt. Welsh, huint. Pronounced, huint. English, we. Mandan, nu. Welsh, ni. Pronounced, ne. English, they. Mandan, eona. Welsh, hona. Feminine. Pronounced, hona. English, no, or there is not. Mandan, megosh. Welsh, nagois. Pronounced, nagosh. English, no. Welsh, na. English, head. Mandan, pan. Welsh, pen. Pronounced, pan. English, the Great Spirit. Mandan, mahopeneta. Welsh, maur penaethir. Pronounced, mosur panaether.
Major Lind also found the following resemblances.
Comparison of Dakota or Sioux with other languages. Latin, blank. English, see, seen. Saxon, seon. Sanskrit, blank. German, sehen. Danish, sigt. Sioux, sin. Other languages, blank. Primary signification, appearing, visible. Latin, pinso. English, pound. Saxon, punien. Sanskrit, blank. German, blank. Danish, blank. Sioux, pow. Other languages, w. Welsh, poinien. Primary signification, beating. Latin, wado. English, went, wend. Saxon, wenden. Sanskrit, blank. German, blank. Danish, blank. Sioux, winter. Other languages, blank. Primary signification, passage. Latin, blank. English, town. Saxon, tun. Sanskrit, blank. German, town. Danish, tun. Sioux, tonwe. Other languages, Gaelic, dun. Primary signification, blank. Latin, qui. English, who. Saxon, hua. Sanskrit, quas. German, wir. Danish, blank. Sioux, tuwe. Other languages, blank. Primary signification, blank. Latin, blank. English, weapon. Saxon, wepn. Sanskrit, blank. German, wapen. Danish, wapen. Sioux, wipe. Other languages, blank. Primary signification, Sioux diminutive, wipena. Latin, ego. English, I. Saxon ich, Sanskrit agam, German ich, Danish jeg. Sioux mish, other languages blank, primary signification blank. Latin cor, English corre, Saxon blank, Sanskrit blank, German blank, Danish blank. Sioux ko, Greek kear, primary signification center heart. Latin blank, English 8, Saxon achte, Sanskrit alte, German acht, Danish otte. Sioux shaktogan. Other languages Greek okto, primary signification blank. Latin kanna, English cane, Saxon blank, Sanskrit blank, German blank, Danish blank. Sioux can. Other languages Hebrew can, Welsh cawn, primary signification reed, weed, wood. Latin puck, English pock, Saxon puck. Sanskrit blank, German pucke, Danish pukkel. Sioux pucka. Other languages Dutch pucka, primary signification swelling. Latin blank, English with, Saxon with, Sanskrit blank, German wieder, Danish blank. Sioux wita. Other languages Gothic gewithan, primary signification blank. Latin blank, English doughty, Saxon dochtig, Sanskrit blank, German taugen, Danish digtig. Sioux dita ditaya. Other languages blank, primary signification hot, brave, daring. Latin blank, English tight, Saxon tien, Sanskrit blank, German dicht, Danish digt. Sioux titan. Other languages blank, primary signification strain. Latin tango, ductus, English touch, take, Saxon teiken, Sanskrit blank, German tiken, Danish tekken. Sioux tan, htaka. Other languages blank, primary signification touch, take. Latin blank, English child, Saxon child, Sanskrit blank, German kind, Danish kuld. Sioux kin. Other languages blank, primary signification progeny. Latin blank, English work, Saxon werken, Sanskrit blank, German blank, Danish blank. Sioux wokas, hekon. Other languages Dutch werk, Spanish hecho, primary signification labor, motion. Latin blank, English shackle, Saxon shokul, Sanskrit blank, German blank, Danish blank. Sioux shka. Other languages Aramaic shakala, Dutch shakel, teton, shakalan. Primary signification to bind, a link. Latin blank, English query, Sanskrit blank, German blank, Danish blank. Sioux quiva. Other languages blank, primary signification blank. Latin blank, English shabby, Sanskrit blank, German shabig, Danish shabig. Sioux shabia. Other languages blank, primary signification blank.
According to Major Lind, the Dakotas, or Sioux, belong to the same race as the Mandans, hence the interest which attaches to these verbal similarities. Among the Iroquois there is a tradition that the sea and waters infringed upon the land, so that all human life was destroyed. The Chickasaws assert that the world was once destroyed by water, but that one family was saved, and two animals of every kind. The Sioux say there was a time when there was no dry land, and all men had disappeared from existence. See Lynd's Manuscript History of the Dakotas, Library of Historical Society of Minnesota. The Okanagus have a god, Skyape, and also one called Chacha, who appear to be endowed with omniscience, but their principal divinity is their great mythical ruler and heroine, Scomalt. Long ago, when the sun was no bigger than a star, this strong medicine woman ruled over what appeared to have now become a lost island. At last the peace of the island was destroyed by war, and the noise of battle was heard, with which Scomalt was exceeding wroth, whereupon she rose up in her might and drove her rebellious subjects to one end of the island, and broke off the piece of land on which they were huddled, and pushed it out to sea, to drift whither it would. This floating island was tossed to and fro and buffeted by the winds, till all but two died. A man and a woman escaped in a canoe, and arrived on the mainland, and from there the Okanagus are descended. This from Bancroft's Native Races, Volume 3, page 149. Here we have the flood legend clearly connected with a lost island. The Nicaraguans believed that ages ago the world was destroyed by a flood in which the most part of mankind perished. Afterward the Teotes, or gods, restored the earth as at the beginning. That from page 75 of Bancroft's Native Races. The wild Apaches, wild from their natal hour, have a legend that the first days of the world were happy and peaceful days. Then came a great flood, from which Montezuma and the coyote alone escaped. Montezuma became then very wicked, and attempted to build a house that would reach to heaven, but the Great Spirit destroyed it with thunderbolts. Again, Bancroft, Volume 3, page 76. The Pimas, an Indian tribe allied to the Papagos, have a peculiar flood legend. The son of the Creator was called Zukka, as possibly Zeus. An eagle prophesied the deluge to the prophet of the people 3 times in succession, but his warning was despised. Then, in the twinkling of an eye, there came a peal of thunder and an awful crash, and a green mound of water reared itself over the plain. It seemed to stand upright for a second, then, cut incessantly by the lightning, goaded on like a great beast, it flung itself upon the prophet's hut. When the morning broke, there was nothing to be seen alive but one man, if indeed he were a man. Zukka, the son of the Creator, had saved himself by floating on a ball of gum or resin. This instantaneous catastrophe reminds one forcibly of the destruction of Atlantis. Zukka killed the eagle, restored its victims to life, and repeopled the earth with them, as Deucalion repeopled the earth with the stones. End of Chapter 5, Section 13, Part 2. Recording by Mike Harris. Part 2, Chapter 6 of Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Harris. Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. Chapter 6. Some consideration of the Deluge legends. The fountains of the great deep. As Atlantis perished in a volcanic convulsion, it must have possessed volcanoes. This is rendered the more probable when we remember that the ridge of land of which it was a part, stretching from north to south, from Iceland to St. Helena, contains even now great volcanoes, as in Iceland, the Azores, the Canaries, etc., and that the very seabed along the line of its original axis is to this day, as we have shown, the scene of great volcanic disturbances. If, then, the mountains of Atlantis contained volcanoes, of which the peaks of the Azores are the surviving representatives, it is not improbable that the convulsions which drowned it in the sea was accompanied by great discharges of water. We have seen that such discharges occurred in the island of Java, when 4,000 people perished. Immense columns of hot water and boiling mud were thrown out of the volcano of Galung Gung. The water was projected from the mountain like a water spout. When a volcanic island was created near Sicily in 1831, it was accompanied by a water spout 60 feet high. In the island of Dominica, one of the islands constituting the leeward group of the West Indies, and nearest to the site of Atlantis, on the 4th of January, 1880, occurred a series of convulsions which reminded us forcibly of the destruction of Plato's island. And the similarity extends to another particular. Dominica contains, like Atlantis, we are told, numerous hot and sulphur springs. I abridge the account given by the New York Herald of January 28, 1880. A little after 11 o'clock a.m., soon after High Mass in the Roman Catholic Cathedral, and while divine service was still going on in the Anglican and Wesleyan chapels, all the indications of an approaching thunderstorm suddenly showed themselves. The atmosphere, which just previously had been cool and pleasant, slight showers falling since early morning, became at once nearly stifling hot. The rumbling of distant thunder was heard, and the light blue and fleecy white of the sky turned into a heavy and lowering black. Soon the thunder peals came near and loud, the lightning flashes of a blue and red color more frequent and vivid, and the rain, first with a few heavy drops, commenced to pour as if the floodgates of heaven were open. In a moment it darkened as if night had come. A strong, nearly overpowering smell of sulphur announced itself, and people who happened to be out in the streets felt the raindrops falling on their heads, backs, and shoulders like showers of hailstones. The cause of this was to be noted by looking at the spouts from which the water was rushing like so many cataracts of molten lead, while the gutters below ran swollen streams of thick gray mud, looking like nothing ever seen in them before. In the meantime, the Rousseau River had worked itself into a state of mad fury, overflowing its banks, carrying down rocks and large trees, and threatening destruction to the bridges over it and the houses in its neighborhood. When the storm ceased, it lasted till 12 midday. The roofs and walls of the buildings in town, the street pavement, the doorsteps, and backyards were found covered with a deposit of volcanic debris, holding together like clay, dark gray in color, and in some places more than an inch thick, with small, shining, metallic particles on the surface, which could be easily identified as iron pyrites. Scraping up some of the stuff, it required only a slight examination to determine its main constituents: sandstone and magnesia, the pyrites being slightly mixed, and silver showing itself in even smaller quantity. This is, in fact, the composition of the volcanic mud thrown up by the soufrières at Wattenwaven and in the Boiling Lake country, and it is found in solution as well in the lake water. The Devil's Billiard Table, within half a mile of the Boiling Lake, is composed wholly of this substance, which there assumes the character of stone in formation. Inquiries instituted on Monday morning revealed the fact that, except on the southeast, the mud shower had not extended beyond the limits of the town. On the northwest, in the direction of Fond Colo and Morne Daniel, nothing but pure rainwater had fallen, and neither Loubière nor Point Michel had seen any signs of volcanic disturbance. But what happened at Point Mulâtre enabled us to spot the locale of the eruption. Point Mulâtre lies at the foot of the range of mountains on the top of which the Boiling Lake frets and seethes. The only outlet of the lake is a cascade which falls into one of the branches of the Point Mulâtre River, the color and temperature of which at one time and another shows the existence, or otherwise, of volcanic activity in the lake country. We may observe, en passant, that the fall of the water from the lake is similar in appearance to the falls on the sides of Roy-Rama, in the interior of British Guiana. There is no continuous stream, but the water overleaps its basin like a kettle boiling over, and comes down in detached cascades from the top. May there not be a boiling lake on the unapproachable summit of Roy-Rama? The phenomena noted at Point Mulâtre on Sunday were similar to what we witnessed in Rousseau, but with every feature more strongly marked. The fall of mud was heavier, covering all the fields. The atmospheric disturbance was greater, and the change in the appearance of the running water about the place more surprising. The Point Mulâtre river suddenly began to run volcanic mud and water. Then the mud predominated, and almost buried the stream under its weight, and the odor of sulphur in the air became positively oppressive. Soon the fish in the water, brochet, camus, mehe, crocro, mullet, down to the eel, the crawfish, the loche, the tatar, and the dormer, died, and were thrown on the banks. The mud carried down by the river has formed a bank at the mouth, which nearly dams up the stream, and threatens to throw it back over the low-lying lands of the Point Mulâtre estate. The reports from the Laudat section of the Boiling Lake district are curious. The Bachelor and Admiral rivers, and the numerous mineral springs which arise in that part of the island, are all running a thick white flood like cream milk. The face of the entire country, from the Admiral River to the Solfatara Plain, has undergone some portentous change, which the frightened peasants who bring the news to Rousseau seem unable clearly and connectedly to describe, and the volcanic activity still continues. From this account it appears that the rain of water and mud came from a boiling lake on the mountains. It must have risen to a great height, like a water spout, and then fallen in showers over the face of the country. We are reminded in this boiling lake of Dominica of the Welsh legend of the eruption of Llyn, the lake of waves, which inundated the whole country. On the top of a mountain in the county of Kerry in Ireland, called Mangerton, there is a deep lake known as Pulifron, which signifies hell hole. It frequently overflows, and rolls down the mountain in frightful torrents. On Slieve Donart, in the territory of Mourne, in the county of Down, Ireland, a lake occupies the mountain top, and its overflowings help to form rivers. If we suppose the destruction of Atlantis to have been in like manner, accompanied by a tremendous outpour of water from one or more of its volcanoes thrown to a great height and deluging the land, we can understand the description in the Chaldean legend of the terrible water spout, which even the gods grew afraid of, and which rose to the sky, and which seems to have been one of the chief causes, together with the earthquake, of the destruction of the country. And in this view we are confirmed by the Aramaean legend of the Deluge, probably derived at an earlier age from the Chaldean tradition. In it we are told, "All on a sudden enormous volumes of water issued from the earth, and rains of extraordinary abundance began to fall. The rivers left their beds, and the ocean overflowed its banks." The disturbance in Dominica duplicates this description exactly. In a moment the water and mud burst from the mountains, the floodgates of heaven were opened, and the river overflowed its banks. And here again we are reminded of the expression in Genesis, "The same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up." Chapter 7, number 11. That this does not refer to the rain is clear from the manner in which it is stated. "The same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the rain was upon the earth," etc. And when the work of destruction is finished, we are told, "The fountains also of the deep and the windows of heaven were stopped." This is a reminiscence by an inland people, living where such tremendous volcanic disturbances were nearly unknown, of the terrible water spout which rose to the sky, of the Chaldean legend, and of the enormous volumes of water issuing from the earth of the Aramaean tradition. The Hindoo legend of the flood speaks of the marine god Hayagriva, who dwelt in the abyss, who produced the cataclysm. This is doubtless the archangel of the abyss spoken of in the Chaldean tradition. The mountains of the north, we have in Plato the following reference to the mountains of Atlantis. The whole country was described as being very lofty and precipitous on the side of the sea. The whole region of the island lies toward the south, and is sheltered from the north. The surrounding mountains exceed all that are to be seen now anywhere. These mountains were the present Azores. One has but to contemplate their present elevation, and remember the depth to which they descend in the ocean, to realize their tremendous altitude and the correctness of the description given by Plato. In the Hindoo legend we find the fish god, who represents Poseidon, father of Atlantis, helping man over the mountain of the north. In the Chaldean legend, Khasisatra's vessel is stopped by the mountain of Nizir until the sea goes down, the mud which stopped navigation. We are told by Plato, Atlantis disappeared beneath the sea, and then that sea became inaccessible, so that navigation on it ceased, on account of the quantity of mud which the engulfed island left in its place. This is one of the points of Plato's story which provoked the incredulity and ridicule of the ancient and even of the modern world. We find in the Chaldean legend something of the kind. Khasisatra says, "I looked at the sea attentively, observing, and the whole of humanity had returned to mud." In the Popol Vuh we are told that a resinous thickness descended from heaven, even as in Dominica the rain was full of thick gray mud, accompanied by an overpowering smell of sulphur. The explorations of the ship Challenger show that the whole of the submerged ridge of which Atlantis is a part is to this day thickly covered with volcanic debris. We have but to remember the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum, which were covered with such a mass of volcanic ashes from the eruption of A.D. 79 that for 17 centuries they remained buried at a depth of from 15 to 30 feet. A new population lived and labored above them. An aqueduct was constructed over their heads, and it was only when a farmer, in digging for a well, penetrated the roof of a house, that they were once more brought to the light of day and the knowledge of mankind. We have seen that, in 1783, the volcanic eruption in Iceland covered the sea with pumice for a distance of 150 miles, and ships were considerably impeded in their course. The eruption in the island of Sumbawa in April, 1815, threw out such masses of ashes as to darken the air. The floating cinders to the west of Sumatra formed on the 12th of April a mass 2 feet thick and several miles in extent, through which ships with difficulty forced their way. It thus appears that the very statement of Plato, which has provoked the ridicule of scholars, is in itself one of the corroborating features of his story. It is probable that the ships of the Atlanteans, when they returned after the tempest to look for their country, found the sea impassable from the masses of volcanic ashes and pumice. They returned terrified to the shores of Europe, and the shock inflicted by the destruction of Atlantis upon the civilization of the world probably led to one of those retrograde periods in the history of our race in which they lost all intercourse with the western continent. The preservation of a record. There is a singular coincidence in the stories of the Deluge in another particular. The legends of the Phoenicians, preserved by Sanchoniathon, tell us that Totus, or Tot, was the inventor of the alphabet and of the art of writing. Now we find in the Egyptian legends a passage of Manetho, in which Thoth, or Hermes Trismegistus, before the Deluge, inscribed on stellae or tablets, in hieroglyphics or sacred characters, the principles of all knowledge. After the Deluge, the second Thoth translated the contents of these stellae into the vulgar tongue. Josephus tells us that the patriarch Seth, in order that wisdom and astronomical knowledge should not perish, erected, in prevision of the double destruction by fire and water predicted by Adam, 2 columns, one of brick, the other of stone, on which this knowledge was engraved, and which existed in the Syriatic country. In the Chaldean legends, the god Ea ordered Khasisastra to inscribe the divine learning and the principles of all sciences on tablets of terracotta, and bury them, before the Deluge, in the city of the sun at Sippara. Berosus, in his version of the Chaldean flood, says, "The deity Cronus appeared to him, Xisistras, in a vision, and warned him that upon the 15th day of the month Doisis there would be a flood by which mankind would be destroyed. He therefore enjoined him to write a history of the beginning, procedure, and conclusion of all things, and to bury it in the city of the sun at Sippara, and to build a vessel," etc. The Hindu Bhagavad Purana tells us that the fish god, who warned Sataravata of the coming of the flood, directed him to place the sacred scriptures in a safe place, in order to preserve them from Hayagriva, a marine horse dwelling in the abyss. Here we are to find the original of these legends in the following passage from Plato's History of Atlantis. Now the relations of their governments to one another were regulated by the injunctions of Poseidon, as the law had handed them down. These were inscribed by the first then on a column of orichalcum, which was situated in the middle of the island, at the temple of Poseidon, whither the people were gathered together. They received and gave judgments, and at daybreak they wrote down their sentences on a golden tablet, and deposited them as memorials with their robes. There were many special laws which the several kings had inscribed about the temples. Critias, page 120. A succession of disasters. The Central American books, translated by de Bourbourg, state that originally a part of the American continent extended far into the Atlantic Ocean. This tradition is strikingly confirmed by the explorations of the ship Challenger, which show that the Dolphin's Ridge was connected with the shore of South America north of the mouth of the Amazon. The Central American books tell us that this region of the continent was destroyed by a succession of frightful convulsions, probably at long intervals apart. 3 of these catastrophes are constantly mentioned, and sometimes there is reference to 1 or 2 more. The land in these convulsions was shaken by frightful earthquakes, and the waves of the sea combined with volcanic fires to overwhelm and engulf it. Each convulsion swept away portions of the land until the whole disappeared, leaving the line of coast as it is now. Most of the inhabitants, overtaken amid their regular employments, were destroyed, but some escaped in ships, and some fled for safety to the summits of high mountains, or to portions of the land which for a time escaped immediate destruction. Baldwin's Ancient America, page 176. This accords precisely with the teachings of geology. We know that the land from which America and Europe were formed once covered nearly or quite the whole space now occupied by the Atlantic between the continents, and it is reasonable to believe that it went down piecemeal, and that Atlantis was but the stump of the ancient continent, which at last perished from the same causes and in the same way. The fact that this tradition existed among the inhabitants of America is proven by the existence of festivals, especially one in the Monte Ticale, which were instituted to commemorate this frightful destruction of land and people, and in which, say the sacred books, princes and people humbled themselves before the divinity, and besought him to withhold a return of such terrible calamities. Can we doubt the reality of events which we thus find confirmed by religious ceremonies at Athens, in Syria, and on the shores of Central America? And we find this succession of great destructions of the Atlantic continent in the triads of Wales, where traditions are preserved of 3 terrible catastrophes. We are told by the explorations of the ship Challenger that the higher lands reached in the direction of the British Islands, and the Celts had traditions that a part of their country once extended far out into the Atlantic, and was subsequently destroyed. And the same succession of destructions is referred to in the Greek legends, where a deluge of Ogyges, the most ancient of the kings of Boeotia or Attica, a quite mythical person, lost in the night of ages, preceded that of Deucalion. We will find hereafter the most ancient hymns of the Aryans praying God to hold the land firm. The people of Atlantis, having seen their country thus destroyed, section by section, and judging that their own time must inevitably come, must have lived under a great and perpetual terror, which will go far to explain the origin of primeval religion, and the hold which it took upon the minds of men. And this condition of things may furnish us a solution of the legends which have come down to us of their efforts to perpetuate their learning on pillars, and also an explanation of that other legend of the Tower of Babel, which, as I will show hereafter, was common to both continents, and in which they sought to build a tower high enough to escape the deluge. All the legends of the preservation of a record prove that the united voice of antiquity taught that the antediluvians had advanced so far in civilization as to possess an alphabet and a system of writing, a conclusion which, as we will see hereafter, finds confirmation in the original identity of the alphabetical signs used in the Old World and the New. End of chapter 5, section 14, part 2. Recording by Mike Harris. Part 3, Chapter 1 of Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Harris. Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, by Ignatius Loyola Donnelly. Part 3. The Civilization of the Old World and New Compared. Chapter 1. Civilization and Inheritance. Material civilization might be defined to be the result of a series of inventions and discoveries whereby man improves his condition and controls the forces of nature for his own advantage. The savage man is a pitiable creature, as Menabosbu says, in the Chippewa legends. He is pursued by a perpetual hunger. He is exposed unprotected to the blasts of winter and the heats of summer. A great terror sits upon his soul, for every manifestation of nature, the storm, the wind, the thunder, the lightning, the cold, the heat, all are threatening and dangerous demons. The seasons bring him neither seed time nor harvest. Pinched with hunger, appeasing in part the everlasting craving of his stomach with seeds, berries, and creeping things, he sees the animals of the forest dash by him, and he has no means to arrest their flight. He is powerless and miserable in the midst of plenty. Every step towards civilization is a step of conquest over nature. The invention of the bow and arrow was, in its time, a far greater stride forward for the human race than the steam engine or the telegraph. The savage could now reach his game. His insatiable hunger could be satisfied. The very eagle, towering in its pride of place, was not beyond the reach of this new and wonderful weapon. The discovery of fire and the art of cooking was another immense step forward. The savage, having nothing but wooden vessels in which to cook, covered the wood with clay. The clay hardened in the fire. The savage gradually learned that he could dispense with the wood, and thus pottery was invented. Then someone, if we are to believe the Chippewa legends on the shores of Lake Superior, found fragments of the pure copper of that region, beat them into shape, and the art of metallurgy was begun. Iron was first worked in the same way, by shaping meteoric iron into spearheads. But it must not be supposed that these inventions followed one another in rapid succession. Thousands, and perhaps tens of thousands of years intervened between each step. Many savage races have not to this day achieved some of these steps. Professor Richard Owen says, "Unprepossessed and sober experience teaches that arts, language, literature are of slow growth, the results of gradual development. I shall undertake to show hereafter that nearly all the arts essential to civilization which we possess date back to the time of Atlantis; certainly to that ancient Egyptian civilization which was coeval with and an outgrowth from Atlantis. In 6,000 years the world made no advance on the civilization which it received from Atlantis. Phoenicia, Egypt, Chaldea, India, Greece, and Rome passed the torch of civilization from one to the other, but in all that lapse of time they added nothing to the arts which existed at the earliest period of Egyptian history. In architecture, sculpture, painting, engraving, mining, metallurgy, navigation, pottery, glassware, the construction of canals, roads, and aqueducts, the arts of Phoenicia and Egypt extended, without material change or improvement, to a period but 200 or 300 years ago. The present age has entered upon a new era. It has added a series of wonderful inventions to the Atlantean list. It has subjugated steam and electricity to the uses of man, and its work has but commenced. It will continue until it lifts man to a plane as much higher than the present as the present is above the barbaric condition, and in the future it will be said that between the birth of civilization in Atlantis and the new civilization there stretches a period of many thousands of years, during which mankind did not invent, but simply perpetuated. Herodotus tells us in Euterpe that, according to the information he received from the Egyptian priests, their written history dated back 11,340 years before his era, or nearly 14,000 years prior to this time. They introduced him into a spacious temple, and showed him the statues of 341 high priests, who had, in turn, succeeded each other, and yet the age of Columbus possessed no arts, except that of printing, which was ancient in China, which was not known to the Egyptians, and the civilization of Egypt, at its first appearance, was of a higher order than at any subsequent period of its history, thus testifying that it drew its greatness from a fountain higher than itself. It was in its early days that Egypt worshipped one only God. In the later ages this simple and sublime belief was buried under the corruptions of polytheism. The greatest pyramids were built by the fourth dynasty, and so universal was education at that time among the people that the stones with which they were built retain to this day the writing of the workmen. The first king was Menes. "At the epoch of Menes," says Winchell, "the Egyptians were already a civilized and numerous people." Manetho tells us that Athotis, the son of this first king, Menes, built the palace at Memphis, that he was a physician and left anatomical books. All these statements imply that even at this early period the Egyptians were in a high state of civilization. From Winchell's Pre-Adamitites, page 120. In the time of Menes the Egyptians had long been architects, sculptors, painters, mythologists, and theologians. That from Professor Richard Owen, who says, "Egypt is recorded to have been a civilized and governed community before the time of Menes. The pastoral community of a group of nomad families, as portrayed in the Pentateuch, may be admitted as an early step in civilization. But how far in advance of this stage is a nation administered by a kingly government, consisting of grades of society, with divisions of labor, of which one kind, assigned to the priesthood, was to record or chronicle the names and dynasties of the kings, the duration and chief events of their reigns?" Ernest Renan points out that Egypt at the beginning appears mature, old, and entirely without mythical or heroic ages, as if the country had never known youth. Its civilization has no infancy, and its art no archaic period. The civilization of the old monarchy did not begin with infancy; it was already mature. We shall attempt to show that it matured in Atlantis, and that the Egyptian people were unable to maintain it at the high standard at which they had received it, as depicted in the pages of Plato. What king of Assyria, or Greece, or Rome, or even of these modern nations, has ever devoted himself to the study of medicine and the writing of medical books for the benefit of mankind? Their mission has been to kill, not to heal the people. Yet here, at the very dawn of Mediterranean history, we find the son of the first king of Egypt recorded as a physician and having left anatomical books. I hold it to be incontestable that, in some region of the earth, primitive mankind must have existed during vast spaces of time, and under most favorable circumstances, to create, invent, and discover those arts and things which constitute civilization. When we have it before our eyes that for 6,000 years mankind, in Europe, Asia, and Africa, even when led by great nations, and illuminated by marvelous minds, did not advance 1 inch beyond the arts of Egypt, we may conceive what lapses, what eons of time it must have required to bring savage man to that condition of refinement and civilization possessed by Egypt when it first comes within the purview of history. That illustrious Frenchman, H.A. Taine (History of English Literature, p. 23), sees the unity of the Indo-European races manifest in their languages, literature, and philosophies, and argues that these preeminent traits are "the great marks of an original model," and that when we meet them 15, 20, 30 centuries before our era, in an Aryan, an Egyptian, a Chinese, they represent the work of a great many ages, perhaps of several myriads of centuries. Such is the first and richest source of these master faculties from which historical events take their rise, and one sees that, if it be powerful, it is because this is no simple spring, but a kind of lake, a deep reservoir, wherein other springs have for a multitude of centuries discharged their several streams. In other words, the capacity of the Egyptian, Aryan, Chaldean, Chinese, Saxon, and Celt to maintain civilization is simply the result of civilized training during myriads of centuries in some original home of the race. I cannot believe that the great inventions were duplicated spontaneously, as some would have us believe, in different countries. There is no truth in the theory that men pressed by necessity will always hit upon the same invention to relieve their wants. If this were so, all savages would have invented the boomerang; all savages would possess pottery, bows and arrows, slings, tents, and canoes. In short, all races would have risen to civilization, for certainly the comforts of life are as agreeable to one people as another. Civilization is not communicable to all. Many savage tribes are incapable of it. There are two great divisions of mankind, the civilized and the savage; and, as we shall show, every civilized race in the world has had something of civilization from the earliest ages. And as "all roads lead to Rome," so all the converging lines of civilization lead to Atlantis. The abyss between the civilized man and the savage is simply incalculable. It represents not alone a difference in arts and methods of life, but in the mental constitution, the instincts, and the predispositions of the soul. The child of the civilized races, in his sports and manufactures, water wheels, wagons, houses of cobs. The savage boy amuses himself with bows and arrows. The one belongs to a building and creating race, the other to a wild hunting stock. This abyss between savagery and civilization has never been passed by any nation through its own original force, and without external influences during the historic period. Those who were savages at the dawn of history are savages still. Barbarian slaves may have been taught something of the arts of their masters, and conquered races have shared some of the advantages possessed by their conquerors, but we will seek in vain for any example of a savage people developing civilization of and among themselves. I may be reminded of the Gauls, Goths, and Britons, but these were not savages. They possessed written languages, poetry, oratory, and history. They were controlled by religious ideas. They believed in God and the immortality of the soul, and in a state of rewards and punishments after death. Wherever the Romans came in contact with Gauls, or Britons, or German tribes, they found them armed with weapons of iron. The Scots, according to Tacitus, used chariots and iron swords in the battle of the Grampians. Enormis gladii sine macroni. The Celts of Gaul are stated by Diodorus Siculus to have used iron-headed spears and coats of mail, and the Gauls who encountered the Roman arms in B.C. 222 were armed with soft iron swords, as well as at the time when Caesar conquered their country. Among the Gauls, men would lend money to be repaid in the next world, and we need not add that no Christian people has yet reached that sublime height of faith. They cultivated the ground, built houses and walled towns, wove cloth, and employed wheeled vehicles. They possessed nearly all the cereals and domestic animals we have, and they wrought in iron, bronze, and steel. The Gauls had even invented a machine on wheels to cut their grain, thus anticipating our reapers and mowers by 2,000 years. The difference between the civilization of the Romans under Julius Caesar and the Gauls under Vercingetorix was a difference in degree and not in kind. The Roman civilization was simply a development and perfection of the civilization possessed by all the European populations. It was drawn from the common fountain of Atlantis. If we find on both sides of the Atlantic precisely the same arts, sciences, religious beliefs, habits, customs, and traditions, it is absurd to say that the peoples of the two continents arrived separately, by precisely the same steps, at precisely the same ends. When we consider the resemblance of the civilizations of the Mediterranean nations to one another, no man is silly enough to pretend that Rome, Greece, Egypt, Assyria, Phoenicia, each spontaneously and separately invented the arts, sciences, habits, and opinions in which they agreed. But we proceed to trace out the thread of descent or connection from one to another. Why should a rule of interpretation prevail as between the two sides of the Atlantic, different from that which holds good as to the two sides of the Mediterranean Sea, if in the one case similarity of origin has unquestionably produced similarity of arts, customs, and condition, why in the other should not similarity of arts, customs, and condition prove similarity of origin? Is there any instance in the world of two peoples, without knowledge of or intercourse with each other, happening upon the same invention, whether that invention be an arrowhead or a steam engine? If it required of mankind a lapse of at least 6,000 years before it began anew the work of invention, and took up the thread of original thought where Atlantis dropped it, what probability is there of 3 or 4 separate nations all advancing at the same speed to precisely the same arts and opinions? The proposition is untenable. If, then, we prove that on both sides of the Atlantic civilizations were found substantially identical, we have demonstrated that they must have descended one from the other, or have radiated from some common source. End of Chapter 1. Recording by Mike Harris.